Another highlight of their time at Camp Anza on their return home was the first phone call home. Camp Anza had one of the largest telephone centers in the United States that was built on military property for the express purpose of the troops being able to make that phone call home. Hi Mom, hi Dad, I'm back on U.S. soil and I'm safe. In those days, a long-distance telephone call was quite a production. You didn't just dial a number. Operators were required to connect that call through many different central offices throughout the United States. So it may take upwards of 2, 3, 4 hours before a requested long-distance phone call was ready to be made and given to that soldier. It was not uncommon for soldiers to wait 3 or 4 hours in line to make that phone call home. It was such a popular element of the return trip through Camp Anza that the hours were expanded for that telephone center to 24/7. Originally, it only operated during the day, and the demand was so high that they just stayed open around the clock. One of those buildings still exists on Cypress Street in the neighborhood. Among the Camp Anza buildings of note that still remain in the neighborhood would be the headquarters building on Philbin. Today that's known as the Aerometer Company. It's owned by Al Hawkins. And that was where Colonel Sarles and Colonel Johnson, who built Camp Anza, and known as the father of Camp Anza, had their offices. The Officers Club still remains, and that's on Picker Street in that neighborhood. And another very large building in the neighborhood is the Camp Laundry. Camp Anza had the largest laundry facility on the West Coast and actually accepted laundry that was brought in by train from as far away as 250 miles. In the 1950s, that building was occupied by the Burpee Seed Company. That became their Western Regional headquarters for many years. Today it's subdivided and holds many different buildings, including medical offices and auto repair shops. The Hamblin Auto Body Shop has a building that's somewhat intact on their property, and that was one of the camp theaters where movies were shown. The projection room actually still exists at the Hamblin Auto Body Shop, and I've been up there and it's very dusty, but you can tell it was a projection room for the theater. Right next door to the Hamblin Auto Body Shop is the Alana Club, and the Alana Club was the Colored Servicemen's Club. It was on the same street, Montgomery, that had the Servicemen's Club, a larger facility for the other soldiers. One of the gratifying things that have come about from my research and finally putting together a book and a museum exhibit and a mini documentary that was done on the history of Camp Anza was meeting some of the veterans. And one couple I've mentioned before is Fred and Louise Woodard. And it was very gratifying to me that we were able to, in the museum exhibit, show Fred's uniform and his officer's cap. It was a tribute to him. He's featured in my book in many places, and he's featured in the mini documentary that's previously been created. And all of that's wonderful. But the touching piece for me was I was glad that he got to see that happen. My book was completed and released in 2008. And I came and did a talk at the Riverside Historical Society, and Fred and Louise came. They were in the audience, and I introduced them as veterans of the camp, as the former fire chief of the city of Riverside, and I got to make mention of the fact that he's featured in at least 5 photographs in my book. And shortly thereafter, within about 8 days, Fred passed away. And as sad as that was for me, it was a very bittersweet time to see him go. But I was so glad that he got to see himself in my book and to know that he is a great part of the legacy of Camp Anza and will live on forever in the book. If you drive anywhere between Cypress Street and Philbin, between Rutland and Van Buren, a good portion of the homes that you'll see there are actually converted barracks. After the war, these 100-foot-long barracks were cut in half, separated, and turned into single-family homes. When that originally occurred and the families started moving into that neighborhood, there was no power, there was no water. The hookups to the city services needed to be created for each home. And so some of the families actually used the leftover World War II latrines as their restrooms until they had a chance to really get their home fully functional. If you go through the neighborhood, you'll notice that there's a profile, a long and narrow building, and many homes carry this very same profile, and that's usually a tip-off that that's a former barracks building. They've been stuccoed over, they've been landscaped in the yards, but if you take a close look, you'll see the barracks profile. Many of the people who live in these homes today have no idea that they're living in a former Army camp barracks building. In addition to Burpee Seeds, one of the other major businesses that first came into the area and really developed the economy and the reason for community in the Arlanza neighborhood was Rohr Aircraft Corporation. They're headquartered out of Chula Vista, California, and they bought some of the former Camp Anza property and built a manufacturing plant on that site. One of the buildings that still remains was actually a loading dock and a warehouse for keeping items that would be loaded onto the trains for their trip, either to the port or after the war to take soldiers on home. One of the things that I know was done out of the buildings that actually face along Arlington Avenue to this day, kitchen cars were created right along there to feed the soldiers on their long trip home. So there's an article in one of the camp newspapers about the efforts that went in towards the end of the war to outfit these baggage cars with kitchen facilities so that the soldiers could eat well on their way home. In the post-war era with Rohr Corporation, aerospace work was actually done, and some of the thrust nozzles for the Titan III rockets were actually manufactured at the tall building that still exists on the Rohr property. That's known as their aerospace building. And that was all taken out by truck or by rail on the old existing railroad line that once carried troops in and out of Camp Anza. At the start of World War II, the Army port on the West Coast existed in San Francisco. That was the San Francisco port of embarkation. Needing more room to ship out troops and war material, the Army realized that they needed more port capacity, and hence the Los Angeles Port of Embarkation was created and the Seattle Port of Embarkation was created. Each of these additional ports needed a staging area. So there was a sister camp to Camp Anza related to the Los Angeles Port of Embarkation for the San Francisco Port of Embarkation, and that was known as Camp Stoneman. In the Seattle area, Fort Lewis served as the staging area for the Seattle Port of Embarkation. I happen to live near Camp Stoneman. It's today Pittsburgh, California, up in the San Francisco Bay Area. That has been swallowed up by the neighborhood. There's very little that still exists there from the World War II days. I believe there is a chapel and there is a monument, a stone monument that acknowledges that Camp Stoneman once existed in what is today the city of Pittsburgh. During my research, I've talked to different people or corresponded with people around the country, and they invariably talk about the local Army camp that happened to be in their neighborhood that is completely forgotten. And remnants of those camps are totally destroyed. And I think it's a wonderful opportunity that the city of Riverside has taken advantage of to preserve some of that World War II heritage that led to the district of Arlanza becoming a community that's part of Riverside to this day. And it's a way to honor the troops that passed through the camp during World War II and the civilian employees who, in effect, ran the camp in many ways. Since Camp Anza was intended to be a temporary camp, most of the buildings there were built to be temporary or semi-permanent at best. It appears that the hospital buildings were better constructed and more nicely furnished. And after the war, with the population growth in Southern California, there weren't enough school buildings to handle the requirement of the baby boomers who were going through school in Riverside in the 1950s. 10 of the hospital buildings from Camp Anza were purchased by the Riverside School District and were placed at various schools around Riverside. 3 of those buildings are at Jefferson School, which faces Arlington Avenue, right across from where McDonald's is. And if you go to the back of the schoolyard, the 3 furthest south buildings, you'll notice carry that 100-foot-long barracks profile that you see at the homes in the Arlanza neighborhood. And those are 3 of the Camp Anza hospital buildings converted into classrooms. One of the interesting places that used to intrigue me as a child was a large concrete structure that looked to me very much like a swimming pool. It was sloped down into the ground, looked like the deep end and a shallow end of a swimming pool. It was overgrown with weeds, and it would fill up with water during the rainy season. So in my 8, 9, 10-year-old mind, I knew that that was a swimming pool that belonged to some ancient culture that existed here centuries ago. What I learned in my Camp Anza research, that foundation that we found as kids and tried to play in when we could, was actually the foundation of Camp Anza's Theater 1. That's the location where Bob Hope and Kay Kaiser broadcast their national radio programs that were heard throughout the country. One of our favorite places to play as a kid was out at a place we knew as Hidden Lake. It was pretty deep in places. We could jump in and not hit the bottom. So it was actually quite a deep lake in certain places. What I found out in my research is that this lake was actually built by Willits J. Hole, and it was officially known as the Hole Reservoir. And it was used and constructed to irrigate the farmland that later became Camp Anza. That lake, that reservoir, stayed there well into the 1960s, and we used to play there as children. And I have a photograph in my book that shows a pier structure out on that lake, and that's the location where they trained the soldiers on how to board and utilize a lifeboat should their ship be torpedoed. The lake was also used to teach swimming because so many of the soldiers did not know how to swim, and that was a place that provided the water where they could teach swimming. Later on in the war, they started using the Arlington Pool to teach the soldiers swimming.